Floppy disk variants. The floppy disk is a data storage and transfer device which was ubiquitous from the mid-70s well into the 2000s. Besides the 3.5-inch and 5.25-inch formats used in IBM PC-compatible systems, or the 8-inch format that preceded them, many proprietary floppy disk formats were developed, either using a different disk design or special layout and encoding methods for the data held on the disk. 3-inch compact floppy disk, or CF2 format. The 3-inch compact floppy disk, or CF2, was an intended rival to Sony's 3.5-inch floppy disk. System. Introduced by a consortium of manufacturers led by Matsushita, Hitachi was a manufacturer of 3-inch disk drives and stated in advertisements, "It's clearly that the 3-inch floppy will become the new standard." The format was widely used by Amstrad in their CPC and PCW computers, and after Amstrad took over manufacturing of the line, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum Plus 3. It was also adopted by some other manufacturers and systems, such as Sega, the Tatung Einstein, and Timex of Portugal in the FDD and FDD 3000 disk drives. Despite this, the format was not a major success. 3-inch diskettes bear much similarity to the 3.5-inch size, but with some unique features. One example is the more elongated plastic casing, taller than the 3.5-inch disc, but less wide and thicker, with increased depth. The actual 3-inch magnetic coated disc occupied less than 50% of the space inside the casing, the rest being used by the complex protection and sealing mechanism implemented on the discs, which thus are largely responsible for the thickness, length, and relatively high costs of the disc. On the early Amstrad machines, the CPC line and the PCW 8256, the discs are typically flipped over to change the side, acting like two separate single-sided discs, comparable with the flippy disks or 5.25-inch media, as opposed to being continuously double-sided. Double-sided mechanisms were introduced on the later PCW 8512 and PCW 9512, thus removing the need to remove, flip, and then reinsert the disk. IBM demi-diskettes. In the early 1980s, IBM Rochester developed a 4-inch floppy disk drive, the Model 341, and an associated disk, the demi-diskette. This program was driven by aggressive cost goals, but missed the pulse of the industry. The prospective users, both inside and outside IBM, preferred standardization to what by release time were small cost reductions and were unwilling to retool packaging, interface chips, and applications for a proper redesign. The product was announced and withdrawn in 1983 with only a few units shipped. IBM wrote off several $100 million of development and manufacturing facility. IBM obtained patent number US patent 4482929 on the media and the drive for the demi-diskette. At trade shows, the drive and media were labeled brown and Tabor. Flippy disks. A flippy disk, sometimes known as a flippy, is a double-sided 4.25-inch floppy disk, specially modified so that the two sides can be used independently, but not simultaneously in single-sided drives. Compute magazine published an article on the topic in March 1981. Generally, there are two levels of modification. For disk operating systems that do not use the index hole in the disk to mark the beginnings of tracks, The Flippy modification requires only a new write-enabled notch to be cut if the disk was designed to be written off. For this purpose, specially designed single rectangular hole punchers, commonly known as disk doublers, were produced and sold by third-party computer accessory manufacturers. Many users, however, may do with a standard round hole puncher and/or an ordinary pair of scissors for this job. For disk operating systems that do use index sync, a second index hole window has to be punched in both sides of the jacket, and for hard sectored formats, an additional window must be punched for the sector holes. While cutting a second notch is relatively safe, cutting an additional window into the jacket is a great peril to the disk itself. A number of floppy disk manufacturers produced ready-made Flippy media. As the cost of media went down and double-sided drives became the standard, Flippies became obsolete. Autoloaders. IBM developed, and several companies copied, an autoloader machine that can load a stack of floppies one at a time into a drive. These are very bulky systems and suffer from media hang-ups and chew-ups more than standard drives. But they were a partial answer to replication and large removable storage needs. The smaller 5¼ and 3½ inch floppies made this a much easier technology to perfect. Floppy mass storage. A number of companies, including IBM and Burroughs, experimented with using large numbers of unenclosed disks to create massive amounts of storage. The Burroughs system uses a stack of 256 12-inch disks spinning at a high speed. The disk to be accessed is selected by using air jets to part the stack, and then a pair of heads flies over the surface as in some hard disk drives. This approach in some way anticipated the Bernoulli disk technology implemented in the Lumega Bernoulli box, but head crashes or air failures were spectacularly messy. The program did not reach production. 2-inch floppy disks. At least two mutually incompatible floppy disks measuring 2 inches appeared in the 1980s. One of these, officially referred to as a video floppy, or VF for short, can be used to store video information for still video cameras, such as the original Sony Mavica, not to be confused with the later digital Mavica models, and the Ion and Zapshot cameras from Canon. VF is not a digital data format. Each track on the disc stores one video field in the analog interlaced composite video format in either the North American NTSC or European PAL standard. This yields a capacity of 25 images per disc in frame mode and 50 in field mode. Another one, the LT1, is digitally formatted, 720 kilobytes, 245 TPI, 80 tracks per side, double-sided, double density. They were used exclusively in the Zenith Minisport laptop computer circa 1989, although the media exhibited nearly identical performances to the 3.5-inch discs of the time. They were not very successful. This was due in part to the scarcity of other devices using this drive, making it impractical for software transfer, and high media cost, which was much more than 3.5-inch and 5¼ discs of the time. Standard floppy replacements. A number of attempts were made by various companies to introduce newer floppy disk formats based on the standard 3.5-inch physical format. Most of these systems provided the ability to read and write standard DD and HD disks, while at the same time introducing a much higher capacity format as well. None of these ever reached the point where it could be assumed that every current PC would have one, but they have now largely been replaced by optical disks, burners, and flash storage. Nevertheless, the 5¼ and 3.5-inch sizes remain to this day as the standards for drive bays in computer cases. the former used for optical drives, including Blu-ray, and the later for hard disk drives. The main technological change for the higher capacity formats was the addition of tracking information on the disk surface to allow the read and write heads to be positioned more accurately. Normal disks have no such information, so the drives use feed-forward positioning by a stepper motor in order to position their heads over the desired track. For good interoperability of disks among drives, this requires precise alignment of the drive's head to a reference standard, somewhat similar to the alignment required to get the best performance out of an audio tape deck. The newer system generally use marks burned onto the surface of the disk to find the tracks, allowing the track width to be greatly reduced. In 1990, an attempt was made to standardize details for 20 megabyte 3.5-inch format floppy. At the time, 3 different technologies that are not interchangeable existed. One major goal was that the to-be-developed standard drive be backward compatible, that it be able to read 720K and 1.44 megabyte floppies. Flextra. As early as 1987, Breer Technology announced the Flextra BR3020, which boasts 21.4 megabyte, a value used for marketing. Its true size is 21,040 kilobytes, 2 sides times 226 cylinders times 40 sectors times 512 bytes, or 25 megabytes unformatted. Around 1990, it announced the BR3225 drive, which was supposed to double the capacity and also read standard DD, HD, and ED 3.5-inch discs. However, the drive was still not released in 1992. It uses 3.5-inch standard disc jackets, whose discs were low-frequency magnetic servo information embedded in them for use with the twin-tier tracking technology. Media was manufactured by Verbatim. Quantum sold the drives under the Quad Flextra name. Floptical. In 1991, Insight Peripherals introduced the Floptical, which uses an infrared LED to position the heads over marks in the disk surface. The original drive stores 21 megabytes, while also reading and writing standard DD and HD floppies. In order to improve data transfer speeds and make the high-capacity drive usefully quick as well, the drives were attached to the system during the SC-SI connector instead of the formal floppy controller. This makes them appear to the operating system as a hard drive instead of a floppy, meaning that most PCs are unable to boot from them because they aren't close enough in structure to bootable hard disks either. This again adversely affected pickup rates. Insight licensed their technology to a number of companies who introduced compatible devices as well as even larger capacity formats. The most popular of these by far was the LS120 mentioned below. Zip drive. In 1994, Iomega introduced the zip drive. Although neither size, the original or the later pocket zip drive, conforms to the 3.5-inch form factor, and hence is not compatible with standard 1.44 megabyte drives. The original physical size still became the most popular of the super floppies. The first version boasted 100 megabytes, later versions boasted 250 megabytes, and then 750 megabytes of storage, until the pocket zip, formerly known as Click, was developed with 40 megabytes. Though zip drives gained in popularity for several years, they never reached the same market penetration as standard floppy drives, since only some new computers were sold with the drives. The rise of desktop publishing and computer graphics led to much larger file sizes. Zip disks greatly eased the exchange of files that were too big to fit on a standard 3.5-inch floppy or an email attachment. When there was no high-speed connection to transfer the file to the recipient, eventually the The falling prices of compact disc optical media and later flash storage, along with notorious hardware failures, the so-called click of death, reduced the popularity of the zip drive. LS-120 and the LS-240. Announced in 1995, the SuperDisk market as the LS-120 drive, often seen with the brand names Matsushita or Panasonic, and Imitation, had an initial capacity of 120 megabytes. LS in this case stands for laser servo, which uses a very low-powered superluminescent LED that generates light with a small focal point. This allows the drive to align its rotation to precisely the same point each time, allowing far more data to be written due to the absence of conventional magnetic alignment marks. The alignment is based on hard-coded optical alignment marks, which meant that a complete format can safely be done. This worked very well at the time, and as a result, failures associated with magnetic fields wiping the zip drive alignment Z tracks were less of a problem. This was also able to read and write to standard floppy disks about 5 times as fast as standard floppy drives. It was upgraded as the LS-240 to 240 megabytes. Not only can the drive read and write 1,440 kilobyte disks, but the last versions of the drive can write 32 megabyte onto a normal 1,440 kilobyte disk. Unfortunately, popular opinion held the SuperDisk to be quite unreliable, though no more than the SIP drives and SciQuest technology offerings of the same period, and there was also many reported problems moving standard floppies between LS-120 drives and normal floppy drives. This belief, true or otherwise, crippled adoption. The BIOS of many motherboards even to this day supports LS-120 drives as a boot option. LS-120 drives were available as options on many computers, including desktop and notebook computers from Compaq Computer Corporation. In the case of the compact notebooks, the LS-120 drive replaced the standard floppy drive in a multi-bay configuration. Sawney Hi FD. Sony introduced its own Floptical-like system in 1997 as the 150 megabyte Sawney Hi FD, which was originally supposed to hold 150 megabyte of data, although by the time the LS-120 had already garnered some market penetration, industry observers nevertheless confidently predicted the Hi FD would be the real standard floppy killer and finally replace standard floppies in all machines. After only a short time on the market, the product was pulled, as it was discovered there were a number of performance and reliability problems that made the system essentially unusable. Sony then re-engineered the device for a quick re-release, but then extended the delay well into 1998 instead, and increased the capacity to 200 megabytes, approximately 210 decimal megabytes. By this point, the market was already saturated by the zip disk, so it never gained much market share. Calop Technologies UHD 144. The UHD 144 drive surfaced early in 1998 as the IT drive and provided 144 megabyte of storage while also being compatible with the standard 1.44 megabyte floppies. The drive was slower than its competitors, but the media was cheaper, running about $8 at introduction and $5 soon after. Custom formatting types on 3.5 inch and 5.25 inch media. The Commodore 64/128. Commodore started its tradition of special disc formats with the 5.25 inch disc drives accompanying its PET/CBM, VIC-20, and Commodore 64 home computers. The same as the 1540 and 1541 drives used with the latter two machines. Standard Commodore Group, Coded Recording, GCR, Sheem used the 1541, and compatibles employed 4 different data rates depending upon track position. Tracks 1 to 17 had 21 sectors. 18 to 24 had 19, 25 to 30 had 18, and 31 to 35 had 17, for a disk capacity of 170.75 kilobytes, unique among personal computer architectures. The operating system on the computer itself is unaware of the details of the disk and file systems. Disk operations are handled by Commodore DOS instead, which was implemented with an extra MOS 6502 processor on the disk drive. Many programs, such as GEOS, bypass Commodore's DOS completely and replace it with fast loading, for the time, programs in the 1541 drive. Eventually, Commodore gave in to disk format standardization and made its last 5 1/4-inch drives, the 1570 and 1571, compatible with modified frequency modulation. To enable the Commodore 128 to work with CP/M disks from several vendors. Equipped with one of these drives, the C128 is able to access both C64 and CP/M disks, as it needs to, as well as the MS-DOS disk, using third-party software, which was a crucial feature for some office work. At least one commercial program, Big Blue Reader by SOGWAP Software, was available to perform the task. Commodore also developed a 3.5-inch 800 kilobyte disk format for its 8-bit machines with the 1581 disk drive, which uses only MFM. The GEOS operating system uses a disk format that is largely identical to the Commodore DOS format, with a few minor extensions. While generally compatible with standard Commodore disks, certain disk maintenance operations can corrupt the file system without proper supervision from the GEOS kernel. Atari 8-bit line. The combination of DOS and hardware 810, 1050, and XF551 disk drives for Atari 8-bit floppy usage allows sectors numbered from 1 to 720. The DOS's 2.0 disk bitmap provides information on sector allocation, counts from 0 to 719. As a result, sector 720 cannot be written to by the DOS. Some companies used a copy protection scheme where hidden data was put in sector 720 that cannot be copied through the DOS copy option. Another more commonly early copy protection scheme simply does not record important sectors as allocated in the FAT, so the DOS utility package, DUP, does not duplicate them. All of these early techniques were thwarted by the first program that simply duplicated all 720 sectors. Later DOS versions, 3 and later 2.5, and DOSs by third parties, like the OSS, accepted and formatted disks with up to 960 and 1020 sectors, resulting in 130 kilobytes of storage capacity per disk side on drives equipped with double density heads, though not the Atari 810, versus previous 90 kilobytes. That unusual 130 kilobyte format allows sectors 1 to 270 to still be read on a single density 810 disk drive, and was introduced by Atari with the 1050 drive with the introduction of DOS 3.0 in 1983. A true 180K double-density Atari floppy format uses 128 byte sectors for sectors 1 to 3, then 256 byte sectors for 4 to 720. The first 3 sectors typically contain boot code as used by the onboard ROM OS. It is up to the resulting boot programs such as Sparta DOS to recognize the density of the formatted disk structure. While the 180K format was developed by Atari with their DOS 2.0D and their cancelled Atari 815 floppy drive, this double-density DOS was never widely released, and the format was generally used by third-party DOS products under the Atari DOS scheme. Sector 360 is the FAT sector map, and sectors 361 to 367 contain the file listing. The Atari brand DOS versions and compatible are 3 bytes per sector for housekeeping and to link list to the next sector. Third-party DOS systems added features such as double-sided drives, subdirectories, and drive types such as 1.2 megabytes and 8-inch. Well-known third-party Atari DOS products include Smart DOS, distributed by the Rena disk drive, Top DOS, My DOS, and Sparta DOS. Commodore Amiga. The Commodore Amiga computers uses an 880 kilobyte format on a 3.5-inch floppy. Because the entire track is written at once, intersector gaps can be eliminated, saving space. The Amiga floppy controller is basic but much more flexible than the one on the PC. It is free of arbitrary format restrictions. Encoding such as MFM and GCR can be done in software, and developers were able to create their own proprietary disk format. Because of this, foreign formats such as the IBM PC compatible can be handled with ease by use of Cross-DOS, which was included with later versions of Amiga OS. With the correct file system driver, an Amiga can theoretically read any arbitrary format on the 3.5-inch floppy, including those recorded at a slight different rotation rate. On the PC, however, there is no way to read an Amiga disk without special hardware, such as a cat weasel and a second floppy drive. Commodore never upgraded the Amiga chipset to support high-density floppies, but sold a custom drive made by Chinon that spins at half speed, 150 rounds per minute. When a high-density floppy was inserted, enabling the existing floppy controller to be used, this drive was introduced with the launch of the Amiga 4000, although the later Amiga 1200 was only fitted with the standard DD drive. The Amiga HD disks can handle 1,760 kilobytes by using special software programs that can hold even more data. A company named Calop Computer Supplies also made an external HD floppy drive, KCS Dual HD drive, available, which can handle HD format diskettes on all Amiga computer systems. Because of storage reasons, the use of emulators, and preserving data, many disks were packaged into disk images. Current popular formats are ADF, DMS, and IPF. The disk masher's format is copy protected and has problems storing particular sequences of bits due to bugs in the compression algorithm, but was widely used in the pirate and demo scenes. IDF has been around for almost as long as the Amiga itself, though it was not initially called by that name. Only with the advent of the internet and Amiga emulators has it become a popular way of distributing disk images. The proprietary IPF files were created to allow preservation of commercial games which have copy protection, which is something that IDF and DMS cannot do. The Amiga is also notorious for the clicking sound made by the floppy drive mechanism if no disk is inserted. The purpose is to detect disk changes. The various utilities, such as no-click, exist that can disable the clicking noise to the relief of many Amiga users. Acorn Electron, BBC Micro, and Acorn Archimedes. The British company Acorn Computers used non-standard disk formats in their 8-bit BBC Micro and Acorn Electron, and their successor, the 32-bit Acorn Archimedes. Acorn, however, used standard disk controllers, initially FM, though they quickly transitioned to MFM. The original disk implementation for the BBC Micro stores 100 kilobytes, or 200 kilobytes per side, on the 5.25-inch disks in a custom format using the disk filing system, DFS. Due to the incompatibility between 40 and 80 track drives, much software was distributed on combined 40-80 track disks. These work by writing the same data in pairs of consecutive tracks in 80 track format and including a small loader program on track 1, which is in the same physical position in either format. The loader program detects which type of drive is in use and loads the main software program straight from disk, bypassing the DFS, double-stepping the 80-track drives and single-stepping the 40-track. This effectively achieves downgraded capacity to 100 kilobytes from either disk format, but enabled distributed software to be effectively compatible with either drive. For their Electron floppy disk add-ons, Acorn chose 3.5-inch disks and developed the advanced disk filing system. It uses double density recording and adds the ability to treat both sides of the disk as a single disk. This offers 3 formats. Small of 160 kilobytes, 40 tracks single-sided. Medium of 320 kilobytes, 80 tracks single-sided. And large of 640 kilobytes, 80 track double-sided. ADFS provides hierarchical directory structure. Rather than the flat model of DFS, ADFS also stores some metadata about each file, notably a load address, an execution address, owner and public privileges, and a lock bit. Even in the 8-bit machines, load addresses are stored in 32-bit format, since those machines support 16 and 30-bit coprocessors. The ADFS format was later adopted into the BBC line upon release of the BBC Master. The BBC Master Compact marked the move to 3.5-inch discs using the same ADFS formats. The Acorn Electron adds D format, which increases the number of objects per directory from 44 to 77 and increases the storage space to 800 kilobytes. The extra space is obtained by using 1024 byte sectors instead of the usual 512 bytes, thus reducing the space needed for inter-sector gaps. As a further enhancement, successive tracks are offset by a sector, giving time for the head to advance to the next track without missing the first sector, thus increasing bulk throughput. The Archimedes use special values in the ADFS load/execute address metadata to store a 12-bit file type field and a 40-bit timestamp. RISC OS2 introduces E format, which retains the same physical layout as D format, but supports file fragmentation and auto-compaction. Post-1991 machines include the A5000 and RISC PC, add support for high-density disks with F format, storing 1,600 kilobytes. However, the PC Combo I/O chips used are unable to format disks with sector skew, losing some performance. ADFS and the PC controllers also support extra high-density ED disks as G format, storing 3,200 kilobytes, but ED drives were never fitted to production machines. With RISC OS3, the Archimedes can also read and write disk formats from other machines, for example the Atari ST and the IBM PC, which are largely compatible depending on the ST's OS version. With third-party software, it can even read the BBC Micro's original single-density 5.25-inch DFS disks. The Amiga disks cannot be read by the system as they omitted the usual sector gap markers. The Acorn file system design is interesting to some people because all ADFS-based storage devices connect to a module called File Core, which provides almost all the features required to implement an ADFS-compatible file system. Because of this modular design, it is easy in RISC OS3 to add support for so-called image filing systems. These are used to implement completely transparent support for IBM PC format floppy disks, including the slightly different Atari ST format. Computer Concepts released a package that implements an image filing system to allow access to high-density Macintosh format disks.